Retcons, your very personal redo button, the ability to redo a test, to do something better, and to change up how something originally was for the betterment of the franchise and just the writing itself. And for any of you ball knowers out there, I always associated retcons with the ultimate nullifier. And if you don't know what this is, this little doohickey here, it's basically the device that Galactus created that essentially allows him to recreate the universe but remove one thing. Say for example, it's usually used for like physical objects, but for this example, I'm gonna pretend it can remove concepts. So say we have an event of you, right, tripping and falling. This is your event in front of your high school crush. What the ultimate nullifier is gonna do, it's very interesting, is delete the universe and then reconstruct it without that one event, and from there, it allows you to create a different scenario. Usually the Fantastic Four uses it to kinda delete Galactus, or at least try to, and redo the universe without him in it, or something along those lines, but you get the point. Retcons basically allow you to do something that wasn't originally in the cards, and today, we're gonna go over my favorite and most hated retcons for individual characters. The setup is gonna go a bit like this. We're gonna go through the big three of Marvel and DC, the Trinity, Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, and for Marvel, objectively, and I'm not taking any ifs, ands, or buts, Spider-Man, Wolverine, and the Hulk. The OG 2000s version that everyone is thinking in their head if they have any real sense of understanding of the pre-MCU version of Marvel, the best version of Marvel before Disney. What we're gonna do is go through a character and list my favorite, the best retcon for them, and my personal worst or most hated retcon, and basically go through each one. We're gonna go back and forth and flip-flop between franchises to keep things a bit, a little bit interesting and on our feet a bit. And of course, we can make another one with other characters. Limiting it down to 2 each basically allows us to have a better conversation in the comments of your most hated and favorite. But on that note, remember to like, comment, subscribe, turn on post notifications so you know when a new video goes live, because we're on our way to 50k, we're almost there. But yeah, let's get straight to my first character. To no one's surprise, the first character up will be my GOAT, Batman. Now for a character who's been around for basically a century, there are gonna be a lot of continuity changes. When it comes to DC, it's split up into different eras: the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, and the Modern Age. Now, when it comes to Batman, a lot of these eras are actually different universes and versions of the character. The most famous being Post-Crisis, created after Crisis on Infinite Earths, which destroyed the multiverse and created a more succinct, easy-to-digest DC timeline where everything was darker, more modern, and more introspective. And people like this change because for Batman, a lot of people hated the more wacky, silly goofiness of the Silver Age. It didn't really fit within Batman's larger mythos. A lot of those first steps towards a darker tone actually really happened in the Bronze Age. It was a natural progression that a lot of people like to undervalue. But then came the mind of Grant Morrison. During Infinite Crisis, a lot of the continuity shackles were finally released, giving writers more tools to play with from previous continuities. And this is where Morrison works their magic, creating something called the Black Casebook. So for any of you guys who don't really know ball, the idea of the Black Casebook is a collection of random stories and ideas from the 50s and 60s, very out there concepts, things that feel like a fever dream. And the explanation Morrison gives is that Batman has been exposed to so many hallucinogens and drugs, from Joker's toxin to Scarecrow's fear gas, that it's hard to separate fiction from reality. The only thing we know is that Batman either remembers these events or has cataloged them in this casebook. And this is where the merger really begins. Stories like Robin Dies at Dawn gets brought back into continuity. In that story, Batman undergoes military experiments that analyze his mind through intense hallucinogens and isolation experiments. He experiences Robin dying on an alien world, and it feels so real that he remembers it ever since. And more importantly, it introduces this guy right here, somebody who will be known as Dr. Simon Hurt, one of the more important villains of his run and one of my favorite Batman villains of the 21st century. From there, we get more carryovers. Batmite becomes canon again, a fifth-dimensional imp similar to Mr. Mixius Spitlick. And even then, Morrison plays with the idea, is he real, or to be more on topic, is he just a hallucination? Batmite himself says, what is the fifth dimension, if not imagination itself? Giving the reader a chance to discover the answer themselves. We also get the idea that there might have been a Batman before Bruce, his father wearing a bat-themed outfit possibly influencing Bruce subconsciously. The Club of Heroes is brought back, international Batman from around the world, which later becomes the backbone for Batman Incorporated. And then we get the biggest retcon of them all, the Batman of Zur-En-Arrh. Originally an alien who modeled himself after Batman, Morrison reworks this into a backup personality created by Bruce in case his mind ever gets sabotaged. And that's really the core of this retcon. What's real doesn't matter, everything is canon. Bruce remembers it or it exists in the Black Casebook, and that allows Morrison to take all of these wild Silver Age concepts and rework them into something modern, something grounded and usable. And what I really love about this is that it elevates other media like Batman the Brave and the Bold. This show takes all of those Silver Age ideas people thought ruined Batman and turns them into a fun action comedy that's actually a perfect gateway into Batman lore. It modernizes those concepts and makes them accessible. A lot of people aren't going to want to read those back issues of Batman from the 50s and 60s, so now I can just recommend people Batman Brave and the Bold because a lot of that is actually canon now. That's why Morrison's retcon works so well. It doesn't erase the past, it brings everything together under one stable umbrella. Now let's flip a coin, the worst Batman retcon, and when it comes to the worst, we have to go with another one of my favorite writers, Geoff Johns. Geoff is a very good writer, I'll be honest. I love what he's done with Superman, The Flash, Green Lantern, JSA, Hawkman, Aquaman, all of the above. And when it comes to Batman, I will admit he is good in a team setting. I really enjoy moments like Batman confronting Jessica Cruz as Power Ring and helping her understand she isn't alone, being an outlet for her to let out all of her negative emotions, and for her to realize that people will be there for you if you ask for help. However, when it comes to his Batman stories, he hasn't had the greatest track record, I'll be honest, and unlike other writers where their worst ideas gets ignored, John's implementations tend to stick in canon. So if you don't already know what I'm talking about, not like I'm already waving a flag, I might as well spell it out for you. The Three Jokers. This idea comes from Darkseid War, where Batman just robs Metron of his Mobius chair, literally yanks that boy off, and gaining infinite knowledge the moment he sits in the chair. And he asks one question, well, a couple of them, but the most important one is, what is the Joker's real identity? And the answer leads to the reveal that there are three Jokers, three different people, the criminal, the clown, and the comedian, each representing different eras of the character. And on paper, that sounds interesting, but in execution, it completely falls flat. The distinctions between them are very weak. The criminal is the easiest to identify because he's more serious and doesn't joke as much, but beyond that, their actions and personalities feel very uninspired, and more importantly, it breaks logic. You're telling me the world's greatest detective, the police, and all of the Arkham Asylum staff, none of them noticed that Joker was three completely different people with different appearances and personalities. That alone doesn't make any sense. And the idea that these three Jokers never crossed paths, never interfered with each other, never competed, it makes even less sense. Joker is a character who thrives on attention. If there were imposters, I would be elected to believe that he would eliminate them. It's his show, his joke. He doesn't want to be somebody else's punchline. The concept almost leans into something supernatural, three Jokers, but then does nothing with it. Instead, it over-explains a character who works best when he isn't explained at all. Joker's past is supposed to be unknown, That's the allure. Turning him into a multi-person conspiracy just makes things more confusing, and not in a good way. You're not left curious, you're left frustrated, wondering if this should even be in continuity. Thankfully, thank God, this idea was eventually pushed into an Elseworlds Black Label book. And the funny thing is, the joke is on Jeff here, this problem was already solved 10 plus years earlier. Grant Morrison, my GOAT, already tackled this. Instead of there being literally 3 Jokers, Morrison presents the idea that Joker reinvents himself. He goes through psychological shifts, almost like different personalities, depending on the day and the situation. Sometimes he's goofy, sometimes he's deadly serious, and sometimes he's both or none at all. So you'll see him pull pranks 1 minute and show up with an RPG and dual machine guns the next, high in the face and then poison in your veins. All of these contradictions can exist within one person, and that's what makes him more mysterious and terrifying. He doesn't feel human. How does someone like that even exist? That's the question that makes Joker interesting, and that's why the 3 Jokers retcon fails so spectacularly. It replaces mystery with explanation, and not even a good one. At the end of the day, no matter what direction you take Joker in, it will always be better than having 3 Jokers. Now here comes our favorite billion-dollar man himself, 2 billion at this point, and that is Spider-Man. I know, a bit contradictory, but he's doing numbers at the box office right now. And with this character, there are so many retcons that happen to him for the worse that it's hard to actually find one that's really good. Thankfully, I haven't fully forsaken modern-day Spider-Man yet, and I've read some of the recent runs. Nick Spencer's run is, for the most part, I feel very underrated. It does collapse a little bit towards the end, and for a lot of people, the back half is so bad that they don't even want to give it the time of day. But I will say, it does one retcon well. And for Spider-Man, for any good retcon to happen, it has to retcon another retcon, because Spider-Man at this point is literally a parasitic host for these changes, symbiote style. The retcon I'm talking about today is how Nick Spencer handled Sin's Past. Now, for those in the back, what is Sin's Past, you might be asking? It was created by J. Michael Straczynski, the GOAT, which is why it hurts me so bad. But we also have to remember that Spider-Man's biggest ops are editorial, and here they really were. To give you a quick synopsis, Sin's Past is the idea that Gwen Stacy had an affair with Norman Osborn. Mind you, Norman is 50 years old around and Gwen Stacy is 19. And it led to them producing 2 children. And then Peter finds this out, and it breaks him, expectedly, to his core. None of that needed to happen. Straczynski's original plan was for the children to be Peter's, which, while still complicated, very much so, would have been better than the final product. Anywho, this is what leads us to Nick Spencer's run and the Kindred saga. Now, for the sake of clarity, Kindred is this anonymous Spider-Man villain tied deeply to Peter's past, somebody that you can learn more about if you ever decide to read the run. But what we learn is that Sin's past was all an illusion. Before his death, Harry Osborn brought somebody to come in. Who is an illusionist? Somebody tell me the word. Mysterio, yes, that is the character. Who knew? He created a hypnotic scenario. False memories were planted or implanted into Norman Osborn and Mary Jane, making them believe the events actually happened. So what this creates is a scenario where the person who did it believes it happened, and Peter's most trusted person, the love of his life, also believes it happened. So what else is Peter gonna do if evidence, somewhat clear evidence, is in front of his face? And the twins, they were now clones, artificially engineered to disrupt Peter's life and push him to the edge. Now, I will agree this is a very complex way to fix the problem, but for the most part, while a bit heavy-handed, it works. Everything stays within Spider-Man's world. You don't need to go outside for other characters or events. Cloning has always been a huge part of Spider-Man lore, so it doesn't feel too out of place. And making Harry Osborn's plan, It is crazy, and I don't know if you would actually do this, but it's also more personal. Who else would be able to pull this off than the person who was Peter's best friend and the son of Norman Osborn? So while the overall arc wasn't good at all, it removed something that plagued Spider-Man for years. That right there is the key, because Marvel is very controlling of Spider-Man. The story only goes where they allow it to go. So the fact that editorial actually allowed this to be erased after being so negative on this character is a godsend, a complete and utter miracle. And now on the flip side, Spider-Man's worst retcon. Get it? Flip side because he has inverted color schemes. If you played Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, you know what I'm talking about. This bit, oh my goodness, everybody keep count by how many times I do this bit. By the end of this video, it might be completely withered away. But the worst Spider-Man retcon is Peter Parker is a clone. Ben Reilly is the main Spider-Man. Now, the reason why this sucks so much is because it basically invalidates 25 years of Spider-Man history. We followed this character for that entire amount of time. We saw him as a teenager, we watched him grow into the man that he is today, and watched him build a life with Mary Jane. Now he had a pregnant wife and was preparing to live the rest of his life with her. And then, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, all of that was made inadequate, because now we're told that the person we're following isn't even the real Peter Parker. That's one of the reasons why the Clone Saga gets such a bad reputation, because for the first half, in my opinion, it was actually pretty good. There's even some great moments sprinkled throughout the back half. But the moment, and I mean the moment we find out that Peter Parker was the clone, that is when everything started to fall apart. Now, would I say that this was a very ambitious move? Absolutely. To take a mainstream superhero book and make a decision that massive is something I can respect. It's a bold swing. But the problem is that they made people too emotionally attached. Yes, I am of the opinion to question why should people even care if Peter is the clone if that is the version we grew up with. But at the same time, knowing that the person that you're following isn't the original will always be a thought at the back of your head, and it will make you less invested. If not, it will be a sour taste in your mouth. That status quo is a complete shift. It isn't something you can just ignore. Ben Reilly here is now the new Spider-Man. Peter Parker is now supposed to retire with Mary Jane. And this puts Ben in an impossible situation. Because Ben is actually a really great character, he had a lot of potential, and I'm honestly sad that he was given the responsibility of carrying the Spider-Man mantle while also carrying all of that hatred caused by a narrative decision he has nothing to do with. That's a tragedy of the Clone Saga, but responsibility is Spider-Man's name, and it's a part of the game. But I do wonder, what would the Marvel Universe look like today if they actually committed? What if they stuck with the plan? What if the Clone Saga actually became a hit? What if they didn't immediately back down because of fan outrage? Maybe eventually would have caught up with them, but imagine if they followed through. Mary Jane and Peter obviously would be together, their child would have been born because they're in retirement, Mayday or whoever you want it to be, and eventually they could reveal that the Peter that we knew was actually the real Spider-Man. That would have allowed us to have our cake and eat it too. Unfortunately, they caved. Some people would argue they shifted too soon, others would say they waited too long, but the way they eventually fixed it also created its own set of problems. Because it also brought back Norman Osborn, a villain who stayed dead for years, and honestly it was one of the few deaths that actually mattered. Harry Osborn took up the Goblin Mantle, and it was actually a great decision. The JMD Mateus Spider-Man run with Harry was incredible, and the Jerry Conway run already explored that idea after Norman's death. They had already built something interesting and concrete. But Norman came back and was revealed as the mastermind behind everything and the main reason why everybody believed Peter was the clone. Eventually, there is a correction and we get those genetic results back, proving Ben was the clone and Peter was the original. How many times am I gonna say clone? But the resolution here is even worse because Ben Reilly, the guy who had to carry all of this because of Marvel's decision making, gets killed off. His body rapidly turns to dust, proving that he was the clone all along, being hit by Goblin's glider, mirroring Norman in his death in the 70s. And while all of this works as a full circle moment, it still feels like a missed opportunity. Imagine if Norman never came back. Imagine if Ben was allowed to remain Spider-Man for a more lengthy period of time, and then eventually after the saga was ended, they revealed that all of it was a hoax. You could have had this brotherly dynamic between Peter and Ben that we saw glimpses of during the beginning of the saga. You could have had both of them existing together. You could have had Ben raising, or at least training, Mayday to be the next Spider-Man. There were so many possibilities that could have been peak. But honestly, fortunately and unfortunately, I'm kinda glad actually that they didn't keep Ben as the main Spider-Man, because that would have required an unbelievable amount of trust from not only the audience, but from the writers to make it work. Still, I can't help but think about the universe where it did. Although, if we're being realistic, it probably wouldn't have been as perfect as the version in my head. That is literally a franchise killer if done poorly. But at the end of the day, it will always be one of those interesting what-if scenarios. Now onto the Big Blue himself. With Superman, he's a character that doesn't get too many individual retcons. Usually, he gets the blunt force of massive continuity resets built around him. Post-Crisis, New 52, Rebirth, and the list goes on. He's usually at the center of said changes, and they're usually pretty dang massive, but for me, the biggest change to Superman lore came from the Silver Age with one of my favorite teenage superhero creations ever, Superboy. Not Connor Kent, even though he is a G, I'm talking about Clark Kent as a boy. Superboy is really cool to me because it gave audiences a chance to relate to Superman in a way they never did before. Instead of seeing Superman as this perfect being who arrived in Metropolis fully formed, we got to see Clark learning the ropes. We get to see him as a kid figuring things out, making mistakes, and becoming a better hero while understanding what it means to have all of these abilities. A lot of modern versions of Superman, and even the original version of the character, have him debut as Superman around the age of 20. But Superboy gave us something different. It showed us the journey. Now, this seems like something a lot of people in the modern era seem to dislike. A lot of people prefer the post-crisis version of Superman's origin, where Clark becomes Superman for the first time as an adult. But we have to remember, back in the day, this was the sauce. Silver Age Superboy was incredibly popular. It was one of the best-selling comic books of its era, and I believe at one point it was even outselling Superman, the main title itself. And that makes sense because Superboy gave readers something that Superman couldn't. A lot of the readers were kids. I feel like the relatability factor is increased because they can see somebody who's around their age doing what they do. And it's more inspiring seeing somebody your age stepping up to fight for what's right. It was effectively the Spider-Man method before it was ever a thing. We were seeing him figure out his friendships, school, girls, and his place in the world. It made Superman feel less like a distant god and more like somebody you could actually connect with, even though I wouldn't use that term lightly, right? Because distant god is definitely misplaced on Superman a lot, but back in the day, Superman was gaining more and more new powers, and he was more focused on being the power fantasy that we all wanted to be. Superboy felt like somebody that we could be friends with. And I would be a fake fan if I didn't mention once again the Legion of Superheroes. I feel like I'm the only comic book channel that talks about them even to this little degree. They deserve their flowers. They are the most misused aspect of the entire Superman mythos. A lot of people don't really like them because you don't really grow up as a Legion of Superheroes fan unless you watch the cartoon, which I didn't until recently, and watching it really got me into the comics, and right now I'm reading the Golden Era, the Keith Giffen, Paul Levitz era, and I just got to the Great Darkness saga, and I'm really highly impressed to the point that I'm considering doing a full read-through. And it does enhance and enrich the story of Superman simultaneously. It tells Clark and the audience that Superman would become the most inspirational hero there is, because these heroes weren't following Superman because of his powers and him being the strongest. They were following him because of his ideals. They came together from different planets, galaxies, and backgrounds because of the symbol and ideal that Clark created. And Clark seeing that as a kid changed everything. This wasn't just some small dream from Smallville. This wasn't just about helping people in his hometown anymore. This was a universal dream of hope and peace that he would spread across the entire Omniverse. Superboy also allowed us to spend more time with Ma and Pa Kent. In the original version, they died very early on, so we didn't really see much of them. They were just background characters there just to motivate Clark to become a hero, just like a lot of stories that we see today. It also really helped to create the blueprint for teenage heroes in DC, because before this, Captain Marvel or Shazam was one of the biggest superheroes around because of how relatable he was. He was a kid who could instantly become a superhero. A lot of the kids reading said comics could easily put themselves in Billy Batson's shoes. Superboy was a way of exploring that same idea, but a bit differently. Instead of Billy saying a word and becoming an adult hero, we got to watch somebody become said hero that we always knew them to be. That idea has continued to influence modern Superman stories. Unfortunately, this was something that was removed in the New 52 and pushed into the background for a long time, but then Mark Waid came in with his Action Comics run and said, let's actually explore this for a modern lens. Let's do a full prequel. Let's see Clark as Superboy, and that's where you get to see so many amazing little pieces of Superman's mythology. You see him learning lessons from heroes of that era, from heroes from the future who aren't even the Legion of Superheroes. You see him struggle to maintain a secret identity while his friends are actively trying to figure out who Superboy is. You see his relationship with Lana Lang, because Lana loves Superboy while Clark is standing right there. She's literally speaking to Clark about how much she loves Superboy. He's stuck in a love triangle with himself. And then, later on, presumably, you add in his friendship with Lex Luthor. Seeing Clark and Lex as childhood friends in Smallville adds so much more weight to their future rivalry. It shows that Lex wasn't always just a random villain, he was somebody who knew Clark before the world knew Superman. And then you got the political side of things. You see young Clark being naive, trusting the government, and slowly realizing that sometimes the people in power aren't always the heroes. Characters like General Sam Lane, Lois Lane's father, become a part of Clark's story very early on and help shape his worldview. You even get moments where younger Clark interacts and saves the current Superman, showing how important those early years were to creating the person he becomes. And beyond all of that, you get little details that build the Clark Kent persona, the adoption process, the fear that Mom Pa Kent had that nobody else would be able to take care of him in the same way, learning that Kal-El was an alien refugee, building the Clark Kent identity, giving him glasses to hide his incredibly blue eyes, changing his posture, his mannerisms, the way that he speaks, the way that he puts himself in certain situations. Everything about Clark Kent is something that was created to protect the people he loves while hiding who he really is. And there's where the loneliness comes in. All those little pieces create a fascinating expansion of Superman's mythology, really delving deep into what makes Superman special. It's really just about diving into all these common Superman tropes and just fleshing them out a lot more. To me, Superboy doesn't make Superman less special, it makes him more so. It shows that Superman wasn't just born the greatest hero in the universe, he had to learn, grow, and become a better hero and a better person. Vibrating ourselves into Earth 3. I'm still going, we're going down different frequencies here. The worst Superman retcon so far will not surprise you because we've been talking about Silver Age influence. There's only one option. My most hated retcon is the post-crisis John Byrne stuff. Now, I know this is a very beloved run for many people. John Byrne's Superman is considered one of the most important eras of the character, but I'm going to go through why I and a lot of other people don't like what was done in this run for Superman in the long term. I'm at the point where I think post-crisis Superman is extremely overrated, and ironically, I think post-Crisis Superman became a lot better and greater later on, after all of this original fluff was thrown away. When Jeff Loeb, Joe Kelly, Joe Casey, Mark Schultz, and Greg Rucka came, along with others, during the 2000s, that's when I think post-Crisis Superman really found its identity. But that also means you have to ignore most of the late 80s and 90s, besides major events like the creation of Doomsday, the death of Superman, and other important additions. Then, by Infinite Crisis in 2005, we started seeing a restoration of a lot of that pre-Crisis mythology that I talked about earlier. But to go through the things that I generally disliked about this version, the first thing is Krypton. Krypton was always supposed to be this vibrant, interesting, and beautiful planet. Of course, it had its problems because no place is perfect, but it felt like a real culture. Post-Crisis Krypton became a lot colder, much more emotionless. The reproductive system itself became more artificial. Everything felt more structured, more militaristic, almost corporate in a sense. It felt less like a society filled with people and more like everyone was just following a program and the orders they were given. And the reason they did this is because they wanted Superman to feel more human. They wanted him to feel like a man of Earth rather than a man of Krypton. But the problem is that Superman has always needed a balance between both. Because if you completely remove his Kryptonian identity, especially when you're using the immigrant metaphor, it creates a very weird message. Why is Superman rejecting the culture he came from? Why is he abandoning his birth planet and completely assimilating into this new one? Is it good to completely remove your culture for the place you travel to? Is that the right thing to do? What message are they sending? Superman being human is important, but Superman being Kryptonian is also important. He's supposed to represent someone who comes from somewhere else and chooses to use what he's learned from both worlds to create something better, a better world. And tying Superman too closely to America also creates another problem. It made him feel less universal. It almost created the exact version of Superman that The Dark Knight Returns was criticizing. A Superman who becomes an extension of the government. A Superman who says yes sir to the president every second like a lapdog. But Superman shouldn't belong to one country. He's supposed to be a symbol for everyone. And beyond that, this era removed a lot of the important parts of Superman's mythology. No Superboy, no Legion of Superheroes, no Supergirl. A lot of the formative years that shaped Clark Kent were removed because they wanted to simplify his mythology. And yeah, I can agree that simplifying everything can be a good thing, but only if you do it correctly. The problem is, they ended up making things more complicated later. For example, Kara Zor-El's Supergirl did not exist. The Legion didn't exist. Then suddenly, they existed. They did exist. I sound like a Splatoon character. Suddenly, they existed, but in a pocket universe. And then they weren't even real. They were robotic recreations. They were basically these weird artificial versions of characters that should have just existed naturally within Superman's history. Why create a complicated explanation for something that already worked? The same thing happened with Brainiac. Do not get me started on Brainiac. One of my favorite and one of the greatest Superman villains of all time was originally, as a lot of us know, a robotic alien-like being from Kolu who collected cities and added them to his knowledge. He shrunk down cities, placed them in his collection, and became one of Superman's most iconic enemies overnight. But post-Crisis changed him into Milton Fine, a circus performer with psychic abilities who eventually became Brainiac. And for over a decade, that was the version we had. It completely removed the one that we all knew, the one that we loved. The same thing happened with Kandor. The bottled city of Krypton was removed. His Kryptonian dog Krypto was never a thing. And in the process, they removed something important from Superman. His curiosity about where he came from. Pre-Crisis Superman wanted to understand Krypton. He wanted to learn about his lost home and his people. This version of Superman is willfully and intentionally disconnected from it. He is more interested in being Clark Kent. He played football in high school, he's completely Earth-focused, and while that can be interesting, removing the Kryptonian side entirely takes away a major part of what makes him unique. The same thing happened with Superman himself. Instead of having a more awkward, humble personality that we know, post-Crisis Clark was a bit more confident, egotistical, and aggressive. Not like these things shouldn't be a part of his character, but it was to the extent that he felt like that grandpa who literally went down to tell people that your music is too loud and to fly away. Literally the boring guy that has no fun and always thinks he's right. Not to mention Lex Luthor. Now, making Lex a businessman was absolutely the right move. That part became iconic. But making him an older man like Lex became a 40 to 50-year-old businessman fighting a younger Clark Kent. So the strong part of the rivalry, the strongest part, was now removed. What was their connection to each other other than good versus evil? They eventually had to fix this by putting Lex into a younger body and hand-waving it away, but this proves the problem. The original idea was just better, along with nerfing him to oblivion. Now this was for the sake of relatability, but it creates another issue. You couldn't tell that he was supposed to be the strongest hero in the world. Yes, Superman shouldn't completely overshadow everyone, but part of the fun of Superman is seeing what happens when somebody that powerful faces impossible challenges. The stronger Superman is, the more creative writers have to become. Instead of just physical threats, you can explore ideological threats, threats that challenge his beliefs. Power creates possibilities. When Superman is weaker, everyone else becomes more impressive. Green Lantern, Wally West Flash, other heroes with more unique abilities. Their stories can feel bigger because Superman isn't operating at the same level. And eventually, Superman starts feeling like the default character you pick in DC Universe Online. Yeah, he's strong, he flies, he has heat vision, who doesn't? He doesn't feel like the guy who's supposed to inspire everyone else. Thankfully, the 2000s fixed a lot of this. They brought back Supergirl, Krypto, they expanded the Super Family, they upgraded Superman's villains, and they made him powerful again. And despite having multiple Kryptonian level beings running around, I was more invested here than I ever was during the beginning of the post-Crisis era. And it took multiple great writers, some of them on the level of the greatest Spider-Man writers, to reshape Superman into something that actually worked. They had to keep hitting that idea like a blacksmith on an anvil until it eventually became something better. And thankfully, Superman has had better luck than a character like Spider-Man because all of these fragmented pieces eventually came back together. The mythology was restored. The balance between Clark Kent, Kal-El, Earth, and Krypton was rebuilt. Other characters weren't as lucky, so thankfully when it came to Superman, DC eventually got its head on straight. The next Marvel slot goes to the Incredible Hulk, and honestly, Hulk might be the king of retcons. It's actually hard to point to a bad one. Most of the writers don't overwrite what came before, they build on it. Over time, all of these changes start to feel less like retcons and more like a single evolving idea. Because of that, picking the best retcon for Hulk is very tough, but if I had to narrow it down, it's easily the evolution of Hulk's persona system. Originally, Hulk was very straightforward, basically the Mr. Hyde to Bruce Banner's Dr. Jekyll. When Bruce got angry, Hulk came out. Simple, effective, and it led to plenty of classic stories. But what really elevated the character was when writers like Bill Mantlo, Peter David, and later Al Ewing started asking a deeper question. What if Hulk wasn't just rage, but a fractured mind made physical? Bill Mantlo was the first to really redefine everything. Instead of Hulk being created solely by the Gamma Bomb, Mantlo introduced the idea that Bruce already had multiple personalities stemming from severe childhood abuse, especially from his father Brian Banner. The Gamma explosion didn't create Hulk, it externalized something that was already there. That's the key shift. Hulk isn't just a transformation, he's a manifestation of Bruce's inner trauma. From there, we have Peter David, and he came in to expand that idea into a full system of alters. Savage Hulk was the childish version, representing, of course, Bruce's inner child. Joe Fixit, or the Grey Hulk, was a more cunning, morally flexible persona who was more of an angsty teenager chasing status, power, and validation. The contrast between them is what made it work. Savage Hulk is more emotional and reactive, while Grey Hulk is calculated, selfish, but most of all, ambitious. Even his whole mob enforcer phase plays into that desire to be respected, not just feared. And importantly, Grey Hulk isn't just Joe Fix-It. That's just one expression of that persona, which adds even more depth to the Grey Hulk character. Eventually, we get Professor Hulk, the perfect fusion of strength of Savage Hulk, the attitude of Grey Hulk, or at least the ego, and the intelligence of Bruce Banner. On paper, it's the ideal version of said Hulk, but that creates a narrative problem. If Bruce can just be whole all the time, the best version, the perfect version of Hulk every single second, what's the point of the other personas? That's why later writers like Paul Jenkins separated that idea once again, keeping the system meaningful instead of solving it permanently. Professor Hulk was another one of these personas, not the main one. And here's where we get into the darker layers of the character, going down the list until things get very interesting. We have the Guilt Hulk and the Devil Hulk. Guilt Hulk represents Bruce's internalized trauma, essentially a psychological version of his father, Brian Banner. It's abusive, very much monstrous, and rooted in Bruce's fear. Devil Hulk, first introduced by Paul Jenkins and expanded by Al Ewing, flips that idea on its head. He looks similar, but represents the father Bruce wished he had, a protector. Devil Hulk isn't just another alter, he's the guardian of the system, someone who will do anything to protect Bruce, no matter how extreme. The contrast between both of these versions is one of the most compelling concepts in Hulk's entire mythos. And while there are more new additions like the Green Scar or Worldbreaker and the Fractured Sun, what I really want to point out is that with this many alters, you'd expect the character to become confusing or bloated. But the opposite happened. Every new addition for the most part adds context to Bruce Banner instead of replacing a part of him. What started off as a simple guy who turns into a monster when angry evolved into one of the most complex psychological frameworks I've ever seen in comics. And the craziest part is, this wasn't some big master plan by Marvel, they were just ideas built upon each other over decades by different writers, yet they all fit together almost seamlessly. It's honestly kind of wild that something this cohesive came from what was probably just a creative decision made on a random day in the 80s. But looking at it now, it's hard to imagine Hulk as anything but this. And to claw it up a little bit, you already know I'm running out of transitions. If you don't know, claw is the reverse if you look at the spelling from Hulk, right? It's literally flipping it around. I know, it's stupid, but he does have a pretty cool mohawk and a cool color scheme. It will never be mentioned ever again. But for the worst retcon of the Hulk, this is a bit of a tricky one, because I've already said Hulk doesn't really have any bad retcons, or at least if he does, it isn't relevant enough to speak about. And even here, the issue isn't the retcon inside of it, but it's what happened afterward. And that is the entirety of the Immortal Hulk. I'm telling you, this is gonna get pretty wonky pretty soon. What Al Ewing did in this run is widely considered to be one of the best Hulk stories ever. It just became too successful. Immortal Hulk didn't just tweak the character, it redefined the entire foundation of what I consider Hulk to be. Gamma radiation, for example, became a supernatural, hellish force, not just radiation. The Green Door was introduced as a literal gateway between life and death for Gamma users. Hulk and other Gamma users effectively resurrect through hell, and most importantly, Hulk was tied to the one below all, the dark counterpart to the one above all. All of this is incredibly cool in isolation. It adds horror and a deeper layer to everything that came before. It even recontextualizes Hulk's immortality in a way that feels new and interesting, but it also raised the ceiling so high I can't even touch it, that it created problems ever since. There's a line that people throw around that came from this book that sums it up perfectly. God has a Hulk. That's not even an exaggeration too. By tying Hulk to cosmic omnipotent forces, the character's scale shifts dramatically. He's no longer just a tragic, grounded figure dealing with trauma. He's now intrinsically connected to universal level metaphysics. And once you do that, it's really hard to walk it back. You can't go to the audience and do the old switcheroo, because it will feel like you've been cheated, like they've done it in a cheap way. So future stories now feel like they have to lean into the supernatural and the cosmic, escalate threats to match that level, or awkwardly ignore it and feel disconnected. Before Immortal Hulk, a lot of Hulk stories, even the big ones, still had a grounded emotional core. The focus was on Bruce, his trauma, and his relationships. Even when things got a bit crazy, it still felt personal. After Immortal Hulk was finished, there was this constant pull towards hellish imagery and reality-breaking stakes. And while that worked perfectly in that run, it doesn't always translate well when every story tries to follow that same escalation. And it starts feeling a bit more like one-upmanship, like why are we doing this? We're trying to outscale each other further and further, until it gets to absurdity. Even in Philip Kennedy Johnson's run, the current Hulk run, which I do enjoy, currently there is this fear of there being too much of a power scaling focus, where he's doing crazier and crazier things, and it feels like it's just for the sake of doing it. While there is an emotional core that I do enjoy, it usually comes in one-off issues here and there that focus on Bruce himself and the relationships he has around him, or Hulk dealing with common issues or the safety of a child, and things like that. Very common things, but through Hulk's point of view, which makes it more interesting. But for the most part, even though I do enjoy the run, that has been more of the exception than the rule. And then you get to Donny Cates, who clearly recognized this issue and tried to pivot Hulk back into something more science-based. This is where we got ideas like Starship Hulk, Banner piloting Hulk like a mech, and rewiring Hulk's psyche into a system he controls. And while I will once again applaud this for being a bold concept, and I can appreciate and respect the attempt to steer Hulk away from being a supernatural overload, the problem is that it doesn't really feel like a continuation, does it? It feels more like a hard reset. Instead of building on what happened previously, it kind of sidesteps it entirely, jukes it out real quick to create a weird disconnect. It ends up feeling less like an evolution and more like a random detour. This is why I would classify this as the worst retcon, because while I do enjoy Immortal Hulk, it leaves future writers in a tough spot. If they follow it, they risk escalating too far into absurdity. If they ignore it, it feels like they're disrespecting a major cornerstone. If they try something new, fans can be hyper-reactive because the bar is so high. So now the Hulk is in this weird position where he's almost boxed in by his own success. He is suffering from his own success, and that is an interesting position to be in. And now on to the final member of the Trinity, Wonder Woman. She is one of those characters who almost everyone expects to be retconned, because every reboot or new era, something about her origin or her world will get changed. Sometimes subtly, and sometimes it's very apparent. And unlike a lot of other heroes, those changes don't just affect her. A lot of those retcons actually ripple out to the entire Wonder family. Characters like Cassie Sandsmark, Donna Troy, Artemis, and even Hippolyta consistently get reworked, rewritten, or outright erased depending on the direction DC wants to take. Because of that, it's honestly difficult to talk about the best changes to her lore without first acknowledging the worst ones, and for most people, that answer is pretty clear: the New 52. Now, to be fair, this run, mainly by Brian Azzarello with art by Cliff Chiang, isn't without its strengths. It's very accessible, especially for new readers. It leans heavily into a Greek mythology aesthetic with a sort of Game of Thrones style drama. The art is clean, the action hits hard, and there are plenty of memorable special moments. If this is your introduction to Wonder Woman, it's easy to see why you would walk away enjoying it. The issue is that this wasn't meant to be a side story though, or an alternate universe take. This was the main continuity version of Wonder Woman. So every change made here wasn't just an experiment, It was redefining who she was for an entire generation of readers. The biggest example of this is the change to her origin. Traditionally, Wonder Woman is a clay child, sculpted by Hippolyta and brought to life by the gods. It's mythological in a very pure sense, almost like a story you would hear passed down through generations. There's something very poetic about it too, something that makes her feel intentionally created rather than randomly born. The New 52 strips that away and replaces it with a much simpler idea. She's the daughter of Zeus now, for some reason, and while that sounds big and dramatic, it actually makes her feel smaller. Instead of being this uniquely crafted figure, she becomes just another demigod in a mythology filled with them. Zeus having children is not special. This man's been popping out babies left and right. It's practically expected. So Diana ends up losing a bit of what makes her stand out just because of this one decision. It shifts her from something symbolic and mythic into something more generic, to keep it honest, especially when you compare her to other characters who already occupy that child of a god space. If I want to read Thor, I would get my booty to Marvel and start reading Thor. But even that isn't the most controversial part. The biggest issue, and the one that really sparked backlash, was how the Amazons were portrayed. In the New 52, they're depicted in a much darker and more cynical way, where they lure men to the island using their appeal, because, they're beautiful women. They assault them, they grape, the fruit grape? They grape them, use them for reproduction, and then kill them afterwards. It's such a drastic departure from what the Amazons traditionally represent that it almost feels like a completely different concept wearing the same name, edgy for edgy's sake. But the real issue behind all of it isn't just that it's darker, it's that it fundamentally changes the meaning behind the Amazons. They were originally meant to represent strength, sisterhood, and a response to injustice. They were symbolic of a world where women could exist free from the harm and oppression of man's world. Turning them into something exploitive undercuts that entirely and replaces it with shock value. The things that men were doing onto them, in the New 52, they were doing onto men. So then it makes a situation where why should we even care about the Amazons if they're doing exactly the same thing they're accusing man of doing? And what makes it worse is how easily that version spreads. This is the kind of story that gets clipped, posted, and shared without context, put within discussion posts that people that don't even read comics start to respond to. Then it shapes how people think about the character. Suddenly, that interpretation becomes the default in online discussions. It's used as ammunition to criticize Wonder Woman as a whole, even though it's one of the most divisive takes on her mythology. What's more frustrating is post-crisis continuity already had a much more creative and meaningful explanation for how the Amazons exist. The idea of the well or cavern of souls, where the spirits of women who died unjustly are reborn as Amazons. This doesn't just answer the question logistically, it reinforces the themes of Wonder Woman. It turns tragedy into purpose. The injustice done unto them now becomes a strength. It gives the Amazons a deeper connection to the world that they're protecting. They were done wrong, and now they're going to use their abilities to help out others. It started off with only their sisters and staying within the confines of Themyscira, but eventually it reached the globe. When you compare that to the New 52 version, it just feels like a huge step down, because it's trying to replace something meaningful with something that's ultimately a lot less thoughtful. So while the run itself can be enjoyable in isolation, as a retcon, it ends up missing the point of the character, simplifying her in a way that doesn't feel satisfying, and what's left behind is a version of Wonder Woman that doesn't quite capture what made her endure for so long. But what if I told you this was all an illusion? Plot twist! This leads us directly to Greg Rucka's Rebirth run that comes quite literally 5 to 6 years after the initial New 52 version. So here we see a complete course correction, and what makes this retcon so good is that it doesn't overwrite Azzarello's run completely, it acknowledges it and then dismantles it in universe piece by piece. Rucka takes a very interesting and specific approach here. Instead of saying this never happened and being very lazy about it, he frames the New 52 events as distorted memories that Diana still retains. So in a way, it's similar to that post-death metal idea where everything is canon, even if it doesn't clearly fit within current continuity. Wonder Woman remembers all of those events, but that doesn't necessarily make them true. They're experiences that she's had, but they've been warped, altered, and in some cases, outright fabricated. They never existed. And that's where the structure of the run becomes really important. The story alternates between two arcs, The Lies and Year One. Each issue switches back and forth. It's very fascinating, one dealing with the present day fallout of those false memories, and the other rebuilding Wonder Woman's true origin from the ground up. It made for a very engaging read week to week, even if it could get a bit confusing bouncing between timelines. Thankfully though, in collected editions, they make it much easier to read as each story arc is collected by itself. But within that framework, what Rucka does is that he reveals that a lot of what Diana believed were false constructs. The Zeus origin, the darker Amazon portrayal, all of that gets peeled away as part of The Lies, while Year One reestablishes the truth, what actually happened. So this illusion that Diana's fighting with is herself. She's caught in the middle of trying to figure out her own history. This gave DC the best out to restore what people actually loved about the character. Eventually, the Clay origin came back. Immediately, the Amazonians returned to a more faithful depiction. The Greek gods feel closer to their classic portrayals again, and just as importantly, it brings back key supporting characters like Veronica Cale and more accurate versions of Steve Trevor, grounding Diana's world into something a lot more recognizable. It also quietly fixes one of the most unpopular decisions from that era, the Superman-Wonder Woman relationship. Wah wah. We are never going to speak about it ever again. And that's exactly how DC dealt with it, letting it fade out without needing any big, messy explanation. It just stops mattering, which honestly was probably the best move. But what about the explanation itself? Why was she manipulated into having false memories? Well, it is a little bit hand-wavy because she was bitten by a mythological serpent, and this really twisted what she was thinking, so it wasn't exactly the cleanest solution ever, and you can tell it's more of a narrative tool than something deeply planned out. But at the same time, it works. It does exactly what it needs to do, separate what should have been kept from what should be discarded. And that's what really makes this retcon effective. Because of what's been done here, the current Wonder Woman status quo feels like a blend, mostly rooted in pre-Flashpoint ideas, with a few New 52 elements sprinkled in here and there when they actually added something of value. They didn't do it much, but when they did, they were praised for it. It's a much healthier foundation than what came before it, and it gives future writers the room to work with without being boxed into one extreme interpretation. Ironically, it's kind of the opposite situation from something like Immortal Hulk. Instead of raising the ceiling so high that nobody knows what to do next, Rucka lowers things back to a workable space and rebuilds it from there. It's not perfect, but it's functional in a way that the previous status quo just wasn't. The real issue now is trying to create a good story with the foundation that's been set, because mainline Wonder Woman has been trash for years now. All we can rely on is Absolute Wonder Woman, which, if that's the one book we have, we're doing pretty well. A lot of characters can't even get one good book. So there are some bright spots, even within Elseworlds and Black Label stories. So as Wonder Woman fans, we haven't been completely left out to dry. All we need is for somebody to capitalize on the foundation that's already been set. And finally, we have the Wolverine, the last member of the Big Three. And just like the Hulk, he is a retcon machine, but unlike the Hulk, he is for an entirely different reason, the exact opposite. While Hulk has really good retcons back to back, Wolverine has a lot of really bad retcons, but also a lot of good ones. And the reason why he works so well for this, especially for writers, is because a large portion of his existence, nobody, including Wolverine himself, knew his full history. His memories were gone, his past was completely erased, and he was basically a blank slate. This gave writers the ability to continuously add new pieces to his lore without it feeling completely unnatural because there's so much about him that we simply didn't know. He just was. He was existing. And that's the best and worst part about Wolverine. On one hand, it allows writers to experiment and consistently expand his mythology. On the other hand, it creates situations where almost anything can be added to his backstory, whether it actually benefits the character or not. And we've seen this happen multiple times. His healing factor, for example, was essentially a retroactive explanation. In his first appearance fighting the Hulk, Wolverine was shown to be somebody who was very slippery and fast, dodging a lot of Hulk's blows, but then we saw he was very incredibly difficult to injure. So naturally, writers later had to explain how this was. How did this guy survive something that should have killed him? The answer was a very strong healing factor. Then we slowly learned that Logan had connections stretching back decades. He knew people like Captain America and Nick Fury, revealing that he wasn't just some random mutant with a mysterious past. He had lived an incredibly long life and had connections to governments and major historical figures and events. Even his own identity was under question and reworked multiple times. We learned Logan wasn't even his real name. There were even theories about Sabretooth being his father because of their similarities in abilities, personality, and relationship. Only for that to eventually be retconned again when previous DNA evidence was revealed to be false. That's Wolverine's entire history, constant additions, changes, and a multitude of questions. But out of all of those changes, my favorite and the most important is Weapon X. Now, technically, Weapon X isn't a traditional retcon because it wasn't changing something that was already established. It was revealing something that we simply didn't know before. But that's what makes it work so well. It took all of these unexplained pieces of Wolverine's character and gave them a deeper meaning. And we have to give major credit and props to Barry Windsor Smith, who wrote and illustrated the entire story within Marvel Comics Presents. It wasn't even originally established or published as a solo Wolverine story, but it became so important to his character that it has been continuously republished and treated as one of his defining character arcs. What makes Weapon X so special to me is how it blends different genres together. It's a sci-fi story with advanced technology and experimentation, but it's also a horror story. It's about psychological damage, loss of identity, and watching somebody slowly become something they never wanted to be. Wolverine always has had an interesting contrast with the X-Men. He's darker, more violent, and more of an anti-hero compared to the rest of the team. But despite all of that nonsense, there's a sense of morality underneath it all. When he's with the X-Men, he's someone who tries to be better, someone who chooses not to become the monster everyone expects him to be. Weapon X shows the process of creating said monster. Logan is stripped down, experimented on, injected with adamantium, and stripped of his humanity. He isn't choosing violence. Violence is being forced onto him, and this is a common trope in a lot of Wolverine's storylines. His memories are then altered, and his mind is manipulated. He's essentially being programmed into becoming an unstoppable weapon, similar to the Winter Soldier. He's being brainwashed, and that's what makes his story so tragic. Later, through Grant Morrison's work, we learn that Weapon X isn't just one experiment, it's a part of a larger program. The X represented the 10th installment in a series of projects that stretched back through history, with figures like Captain America being connected to that same legacy. So Wolverine wasn't the beginning, he was just the latest attempt, and that is very scary. And watching him go through the process was genuinely horrifying. He's reduced from a person into a test subject. He loses all of his agency and becomes something that other people control. The body horror alone is some of the strongest imagery in Wolverine's entire history. Seeing it fused with metal, his bones, and cybernetic technology makes him feel like a Frankenstein monster. These scientists themselves are corporate figures that essentially are trying to play God, trying to create a force of nature that they can unleash upon the world whenever they want. They don't see Logan as a human being. Again, with his namesake, they see him only as a weapon. And that's what makes the eventual moment where Wolverine breaks free so satisfying. You're watching somebody reclaim their humanity after being completely stripped of it. And while it is tragic that Wolverine lost so many memories, in this specific case, that loss almost works in his favor because the things that he experienced would break almost anyone, and the fact that he can continue forward despite all the things that happened to him is what makes Wolverine such a compelling character. His missing memories aren't just a mystery, they're just another layer to the tragedy. He's a man who's lived for over a century, carrying the weight of countless lives, battles, and experiences that he can barely even remember. And finally, I got no topical transition piece anymore. I'm all out of steam. But for the final retcon that I hate for Wolverine, honestly, I have two. One is more controversial because there are people who genuinely enjoy it, while the other one is just universally hated for good reason. So let's start with the more divisive one, the Bone Claws. Now, the reason why this retcon is so interesting is because I completely understand why people like it. From a character perspective, it does make sense. Wolverine is supposed to be animalistic, primal, so the idea that his claws were always a part of his mutation does fit with that image. It makes him feel more like an animal than somebody with weapons that were implanted in him. However, personally, I think it creates more problems than it solves. For one, biologically, it doesn't really make sense. Wolverine is not Sabretooth. Sabretooth having claws works because his claws are an extension of his animalistic mutation. They function more like an animal's claws made from something similar to like keratin, the same like material as like fingernails. But bone claws, that is a completely different thing. There really aren't many animals that naturally grow weapons directly from their bones. I don't even think that's even a thing. Now, obviously, somebody's gonna say, it's a comic book, why are you thinking about biology? And normally, I would agree, comics are filled with a bunch of impossible concepts, but Marvel, especially during that era, was built around trying to create these fantastical ideas with some sort of internal logic. And before the Bone Claws existed, the explanation was simple. Weapon X gave them to him. That was the point. A lot of people don't understand this. Wolverine was not born as this unstoppable killing machine. He was a victim of a horrifying experiment. He was kidnapped, strapped down, injected with adamantium, and had his memories erased, turned into a weapon against his will. A lot of the older guidebooks and Marvel material reference that idea and reinforce it. His claws were artificial implants. They were another example of what Weapon X did to him. They took a normal mutant with enhanced senses, healing, and physical capabilities and transformed him into something unnatural. The Bone Claws kind of weakened that tragedy, because now Wolverine already had the claws. He already had the potential to be this monster. Weapon X didn't create the weapon, they just created something or upgraded something that was already there. And that changes the emotional core of the story. A huge part of Wolverine's tragedy is asking, why me? Why was he chosen? Why did all these people take him in just to destroy his life? He wasn't special because he was already some perfect killing machine. He was just another person who was unlucky enough to be captured. But once you give him Bone Claws, it makes it a little easier to understand why Weapon X targeted him. Of course they would choose him. He already had these animalistic weapons. He already fit the image of what they wanted to create. Instead of somebody being transformed into said monster, it became somebody who was already halfway there and was simply refined. It also creates another problem when you look at Wolverine's history. One of the most interesting things about Wolverine was that his humanity was always fighting against what people wanted him to be, but in this new situation where Wolverine accidentally murdered people, he was already unstable. Weapon X took a man and tried to turn him into a weapon. That's what makes the story powerful. He wasn't there yet. In current continuity, it just seems like he was pushed a little bit more off the edge. But to move away from that and to talk about the more controversial retcon, we have to talk about one that genuinely damaged Wolverine's mythology for years. we have to talk about the creation of Romulus. Romulus is one of those characters who looks cool and people genuinely only remember him because of his design. As a concept, he is basically Wolverine's reverse Flash. He is this ancient figure who apparently manipulated Wolverine's entire life from behind the scenes. Every bad thing that happened to Logan somehow traces back to this one guy. He was behind Weapon X. He was behind Wolverine losing his son Daken. He was involved with Wolverine's relationships and his tragedies, and basically every terrible moment in his life. And that's the problem. Wolverine is interesting because his history is complicated and mysterious. There are things about himself that even he doesn't understand. Romulus takes all of that mystery and says, actually, I was the guy responsible for everything. And that makes the world feel a lot smaller. Not only that, Romulus also introduced the idea that Wolverine wasn't even a mutant. Instead, he was apparently a part of this evolved species called the Lupins or the Lupines, a more animalistic branch of humanity. It also affected other characters connected to him like Sabretooth, Wolfsbane, and Sasquatch, who are also tied to this concept. Suddenly, the reason Sabretooth hated Wolverine wasn't because of their personal history or their complicated relationship, but because they were supposedly from different animal-based tribes. Wolverine was a part of the dark-haired tribe, and Sabretooth was a part of the blonde-haired tribe. Get that garbage out of here! Apparently that meant they were destined to hate each other. It just feels unnecessary. Thankfully, this was eventually reversed, but the fact that this took years is insane. From 2007 until 2012, there was legitimately a period where fans had no idea whether Wolverine was even a mutant anymore. And then we get to the biggest problem with Romulus. Once again, we have to bring up Weapon X. Romulus completely flips that idea by revealing Wolverine was the one who wanted to experiment on himself. He wanted his memories to be erased, and he wanted to become a weapon just so that he could understand what it was like, I guess. And that makes absolutely no sense. We have already seen characters who knew Wolverine was kidnapped. We have seen flashbacks showing that he was forced into the program. We have seen the aftermath of his trauma and his struggle with what was done to him. So now you're telling me that all of it was fake, it was a ruse, that the memories that he recovered were also false. That all of the people who knew what happened were somehow wrong. It creates more questions than answers, and not the good kinds of questions either, because it makes his entire history feel pointless. If you remove that tragedy aspect to him, and you make it that all of his trauma was his own choice, then you remove one of the biggest reasons people connect with the character. Wolverine is a survivor. He is a man trying to be better after everything that was done to him. Romulus takes that away and creates a giant conspiracy that never needed to exist. And that is why, even though the Bone Claws are very controversial, Romulus is easily the worst retcon Wolverine has ever received, because his mere existence is meant to change history, and from there he just keeps throwing machine gun rapid fire retcon bullets straight at Wolverine's dome, and none of them hit successfully. All of them were pretty annoying and changed years later. But yeah guys, let me know down below, what are your most hated and favorite retcons for all of these characters? I only listed one each for both category for every character I mentioned, so there should be a lot more down below that you can talk about. But yeah guys, let me know down below. Remember to like, subscribe, and turn on post notifications so you know when a new video goes live. And yeah, see you all later, take care, deuces, peace.